So my name is Wendy Ring. I am a family doctor. I've been practicing for about 30 years. And I have always tried in my work to put myself where I could do the most good and where the most need is. And for 30 years, what that has meant has been working with extremely underserved communities. I've worked on Navajo reservation, I've taken care of homeless people, I've worked with undocumented immigrants and working people with no health insurance. And every year I'd ask myself, am I where the greatest need is? Am I doing the most important thing? And the last time I asked myself that question, instead of getting the go back to your clinic and do some more answer, I really felt that I needed to go out and do something about climate change. Because as you know, all of our medical professional organizations agree unanimously that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And we have a very short window to do something about it. So first what I'm going to do is just review with you what the science of climate change. If scientists could speak regular English, this is what they would say. So carbon is the basic building block of life, which I've illustrated for you here with the 4 basic food groups and their molecular structure. And the little black balls are carbon. So you can see it's an important part of the framework of everything. So everything that was ever alive has carbon in it. And when we burn things that were once alive, it releases the carbon into the air and it combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. The problem that we're having is that we're burning about twice as much as what our planet can handle. So about half of the carbon dioxide is, a quarter of the carbon dioxide goes into the oceans, another quarter goes into the forest, and the other half the planet cannot process. So it ends up in our atmosphere forming a blanket over the Earth and trapping the heat of the sun, and that's why we're having warming. The warming has been gradual. Over the last century, we've been warming by about 1/10 of a degree every 10 years until around 1970 when things really started to speed up. And this map here is just showing the average increase in temperature per decade since 1970. And you can see that it's kind of uneven. There are some states that have been really hard hit and others, like Washington, not so much. We've also had much increase in extreme types of weather. The dry parts of the country in general have gotten drier, and we've had severe droughts for the last 2 years. We have heavier rainfall, about 5% more rain overall, but heavy rain increases of from 40 to 70%. We've had an increase in the number of extremely hot days and the frequency of heat waves, and an increase in the severity of storms. So what does that mean for our health? Basically, climate change affects our health by affecting the things that are essential for us to stay alive and be healthy. So I'm going to get you to help me with that. What might those essentials be?
Clean water.
Air.
Food. And one more.
Living conditions.
Right, a safe place to live. Absolutely. So we're going to talk about how climate affects these things and how that affects our health, but I think people learn better by participating. So I'm going to ask you to think with me. I'm going to tell you about some people that got sick and have you think with me about what might be the matter with them and how that could be related to climate. So this is a 10-year-old boy who was brought to the hospital by his mother with a cough that wouldn't go away. And he used to be very involved in sports. He used to play soccer and Little League, but lately he has been avoiding exertion and spending most of his time on the computer. Any thoughts about what might be wrong with him?
Asthma.
Absolutely, he has asthma. So what could that have to do with climate? So yeah, this is asthma, and there are a couple ways that climate is affecting people with asthma and increasing the rate of asthma. One of them is ground level ozone. Ozone is good when it's way up in the stratosphere screening out ultraviolet rays, but down at ground level it's a severe irritant to our respiratory system, and it causes inflammation of the lungs and damage to the lungs. So, and when the temperature is warmer, we get higher levels of ozone, because ozone is formed in a reaction from when we burn fossil fuels, it releases some different pollutants into the air, but the ozone is formed when those pollutants interact in the presence of heat and sunlight. So the more heat and sunlight that you have, the higher the level of ozone. And you can see here the bottom line in that graph is temperature, and the one going on the vertical axis is the ozone level. And you can see both in Atlanta and New York, as the temperature increases, the ozone level goes up. And those are pretty high levels of ozone on that chart there. So as I said, it irritates the lungs. So when levels of ozone are high, we see increased visits to the emergency room and admissions to the hospital for asthma, chronic lung disease, and actually a lot of other chronic diseases that we don't know how the ozone is making the other people sick, but it does. And we also see an increase in deaths. And if there is repeated exposure to high levels of ozone, then it can cause asthma. And then particularly in children. Children are more sensitive. There's a big variation in terms of sensitivity. Like one person in a family can react much more than other people in a family, for example. That question has come up a few times when I've given this talk. But children are more sensitive because they breathe faster, and the faster you breathe, the more ozone that you inhale. And children who play sports are even more vulnerable. So there has been a study that followed kids and found that children who played 3 or more outdoor sports in areas of the country where there are high levels of ozone were 3 times more likely to develop asthma than their couch potato counterparts. And as I was saying, that ozone affects people who have chronic diseases, and there's a clear relationship between ozone level and mortality, deaths. And this can happen, and whenever you see a straight line like that, when it's not curved, that means that there's no safe level, basically. What you're looking at is that a little bit is a little bit bad, and a little bit more is a little bit more bad, but there's no level that's not bad at all. So even below the levels that the Environmental Protection Agency says are safe, we see, even then, even an increase that's still under that safe level will result in an increase in deaths. And for people with asthma, an increase in the level of ozone, even when it's below that safe level, will also result in an increase in use of inhalers and an increase in hospitalizations for asthma. So we're not all equal in terms of our sensitivity to ozone, and unfortunately our environmental standards are not geared to the most sensitive. So pollen is another, as you were talking about before, about the increase in pollen. Carbon dioxide is a fertilizer for weeds more than for crops, unfortunately, and it increases the level of pollen production. So there was an experiment that was done where ragweed was grown under different concentrations of carbon dioxide, like pre-industrial, what we have now, and what we expect to have in about 50 years, and the level of pollen production increased with every increase in carbon dioxide level. And not only that, but the pollen season is lasting longer, and the pollen itself is stronger in terms of provoking allergic reactions. We don't know why. And the other side of that, of course, is mold. When we have heavy rainfall and we have flooding, it's very easy for mold to grow in homes, and people who have allergies or who have asthma will have flare-ups of their allergies and asthma if they are in contact with mold. And mold can also cause asthma. There was another research study that was done where they followed a group of kids who were all born around the same time, and they followed them to age 7. They went into their homes when they were 8 months old and took air samples and measured the amount of mold in the air. And the kids who had the highest levels of mold in the air samples at 8 months had a higher rate of developing asthma and being hospitalized for asthma before the age of 7. So it's not surprising that this is what we've seen. We've seen a tripling of rates of allergies and asthma since the 1960s. Now, you could say, well, that could be due to something else, maybe. But Quest Laboratories, which is a big commercial lab, did a kind of a look back at the allergy tests that they had done over the course of a 4-year period of time. And we're talking about 14 million allergy tests. And what they found was that the number of tests that were positive for molds and for ragweed increased by 12 to 15%, and the number of tests that were positive for other common causes of allergies either decreased, like for dust mites there, or stayed the same. So we have pretty good evidence that the increase in allergies and asthma is coming from the CO2 effect on pollen-producing plants. Wildfire smoke is another way that climate change is affecting air quality. Wildfires have increased in frequency and in size, and wildfire smoke has in it some irritants, some carcinogens, but in terms of human health, the most dangerous component are the very, very fine particles, which are easily inhaled into the lungs, and they're so small that they can pass from the lungs into the bloodstream, where they cause inflammation. So when we have people that are exposed, communities that are exposed to wildfire smoke, we see increases in hospitalizations, not only for the breathing conditions that I talked about before, but also an increase in heart attacks, an increase in congestive heart failure, people who already have heart disease who get worse, and an increase in strokes. The other thing that we found out, California is kind of like a lab for the health effects of fire, because we have just been having horrendous wildfires on a regular basis. And so there's been a lot of research done. And one of the things that was looked at was outcome of pregnancies that were happening during the time of the fires. This was in 2003 when we had the big fires in Southern California. And they found that women in any trimester of pregnancy who were exposed to wildfire smoke gave birth to babies of lower birth weight. And lower birth weight, of course, translates into higher mortality, higher chance of the baby dying when they're small.
They born earlier, or they just
lower birth weight?
Just lower birth weight. Just
lower birth weight, not premature. But that increases their risk for a host of other health problems. And the smoke does not just stay where the fire is. This is from a NASA satellite. They have some way of looking at or visualizing fine particulates, and they're showing particulates coming from a fire in New Mexico going all the way to Denver, Colorado. So this isn't, you may not have the wildfire here, but you can still be exposed to the fine particulates. Dust storms is another concern that we're having in the Southwest. And with the near constant drought that we're experiencing there, we're seeing an increase in large dust storms. This is a mile-high dust storm coming over the city of Phoenix. And as a result of that, we're also seeing epidemic of kind of fungal pneumonia called valley fever in Arizona and in Southern California. And it's gotten so bad that California's prison system is under a federal receivership because they weren't providing good enough health care to their prisoners. And the federal receiver recently ordered that all of the people who are at higher risk for that pneumonia to spread throughout their system, which is people over 50, blacks, Filipinos, diabetics, and anybody else who has a condition that affects their immune system, that they all had to be evacuated. So they've evacuated half the prison population in the area where these kinds of dust storms occur. And the increase has been about 800% in the number of cases that we've seen. The other thing, which is a concern to me, and this has not been talked about, the research has not really been done, but the same areas of the country where we're having the dust storms are also parts of the country where we have a mineral that forms from rock that forms from volcanic ash, and it's called aragonite, and it's like asbestos. And just like asbestos, it causes a very rare form of cancer of the lining of the lungs called mesothelioma. And this was discovered because there's an area in Turkey that where there are some villages, they call them the cancer villages, because about 50% of the people in those villages died from this very rare cancer that you hardly ever see. And half the people in these villages died because the villages were built from that volcanic rock that had aragonite in it. So we don't know if that's in the dust storms or not. There was one study I found where they were analyzing some soil in Southern California in a farming area, and they didn't find the aragonite in the soil, but then they took a sample of the air just above the soil and they looked at it with an electron micrograph and they saw aragonite. So it's possible that we could be, if we had increased frequency and of dust storms and exposure to dust, that we could be exposed to this carcinogen. It takes about 30 years for the cancer to develop. So by the time we know, it will be too late. In cities, what we're seeing is, when we talk about dust, is we're seeing an increase in levels of lead in children's blood. And when the weather is hot and dry, some of the soil, which has lead in it, which is a legacy from the leaded gasoline that we used to burn. So in areas where there was heavy traffic, that soil is contaminated with lead. And so when the weather's hot and dry, you can measure the amount of soil particles that are in the air and the amount of lead that's in the air. And then when you go to measure children's blood, the amount of lead is elevated. So this is showing you the seasonal variation. All of those peaks are summers, and the valleys are winters. And what does that mean? It means that 500,000 kids in the United States are getting brain damage from lead, because they have levels of lead in their system that we know are high enough to cause permanent brain damage and learning problems. And this is something that came out of Detroit. They were looking at 20,000 students and looking at their blood lead levels as compared with their scores on achievement tests. And you can see that the kids who had the higher blood lead levels were the ones who had the not proficient, and that it was proportional down from that. So, you know, if you had a little bit less, then you were partially proficient. If you had less than that, you'd be proficient. And if you had a lower level, you'd be considered advanced. So, and this is something, it's not like when it's a house that's contaminated and has lead paint and you can go in and remove it. This is the soil in all of our cities, and if we have conditions where we have increasing dry summers, then we're going to have increasing lead levels in our children. Okay, here's another case. This is a mid-sized city. The public health officer started getting calls from pharmacists that so many people were coming in and buying diarrhea medicine that they couldn't keep it on the shelves. And by the time the cause was found and eliminated, over 400,000 people had become ill with fever, diarrhea, abdominal cramps. Water, yeah. So this is a case of drinking water contamination that occurred after heavy rainfall in the city of Milwaukee. And it was Cryptosporidium was the organism, which is one of the few organisms that causes diarrhea that cannot be killed with chlorine. So they chlorinated the water, but it didn't get rid of the Cryptosporidium. So how did it get into the water? It got into the water because Milwaukee, like about 700 other cities in the U.S., has a type of sewer system called combined sewer overflow. And what that means is that the same pipes that carry away raw sewage are also supposed to carry away our rainwater, our storm runoff. But because we're having much heavier rain than we did before, those systems are frequently overwhelmed. And so what happens is that they have a little fail-safe in them. You can see this little half circle thing there? Yeah, well, so what that is that when the system is not overwhelmed, then that takes this combination of rainwater and sewage and sends it to the sewage treatment plant. But when there is heavy rain, then it overflows and dumps into the nearest river, lake, or in the case of California, Oregon, and Washington, into the ocean.
Seattle.
So, and this is a picture of the Allegheny River, just because Pittsburgh area has the highest number of combined sewer overflow outflows of anywhere in the country, and those people are swimming in it. So we think that our sewage treatment plants and our water treatment plants are able to protect us, but they were not designed for the changes in the weather that we're having. Other ways that people get exposed to sewage is then those systems just back up. So it's not an uncommon thing. In our town, we had a combined sewer overflow system, and there was one intersection where this would happen with every heavy rain. So what you're seeing there is a mixture of sewage and storm water that's coming back up through a manhole. The New Jersey photo there is showing what happens when you have a big storm surge, and that it actually pushed the sewage up out of toilets and sinks. So it was all going the other way. And this is 5 weeks later, and they still haven't been able to get it cleaned up. You can imagine the public health implications of that. Also, when there is flooding, we see contamination of sewage treatment plants with overflow and spilling, and also contamination of water treatment plants for drinking water. So this is just an interesting study that was done where they were looking at kids visiting the emergency room for diarrhea, and they created a model, and they said, we can predict how many kids are going to show up in the emergency room by how much rain has fallen. So the blue line is the rainfall, actual, and the black line are the kids showing up in the emergency room with diarrhea. And we know that after heavy rainfall, the number of hospital admissions of children for diarrhea triple. And because we're dumping that sewage into the same water that we often swim or boat in, we're seeing an increase in outbreaks of infections due to waterborne diseases. So what's in floodwater that can make you sick? Sewage, we've talked about. Industrial chemicals is another thing. Also, when you have heavy running water, we have a lot of kind of pollutants that are the kind that we've made that will never break down, like PCBs, for example, lead. But sometimes they'll settle down into some soil or some sediment. But when you have heavy rains, it washes them all into the water, where they can enter into the food chain and get concentrated up the food chain into fish that we eat. This is another effect of water, just has to do with water temperature. And when the water is warmer, and when you've had heavy rains in agricultural areas that are washing fertilizer and manure into bodies of water, and you combine that with the warm temperature, and you get this big increase in blue-green algae blooms that we are seeing. Now, blue-green algae, aside from being ugly, forms a toxin called microcystin, which causes, if you get it in contact with your skin, you can have a rash. If you swallow a little, you can get some inflammation in your liver and some stomach upset. If you have it on a regular basis, it causes liver cancer. We do our drinking water treatment, when it's working properly, does remove the microcystin for the most part. But monitoring has been done, and microcystin is commonly found at the intake of our drinking water treatment plants. And it's found even in lakes and rivers where you can't see any algae. So about 30% of the lakes in the Midwest that were tested for microcystin that didn't have anything that you could see had levels of microcystin that are higher than what's safe for human health. So this is also causing closure of a lot of beaches, which is not only a shame for people who wanted to swim at those beaches, but it's a big economic impact for those communities. The area close to the shore where the algae tends to kind of crust up and be thicker, can have levels of microcystin that are about 1,000 times higher than maybe what's out in the middle of the lake. And this is the area where dogs and children usually play, so that's particularly dangerous. And there have been a number of dogs that have died. I'm not aware of any kids that have died, because public health departments are pretty good about testing now and closing down those beaches. This is a 40-year-old man who started feeling unwell about 30 minutes after dinner. He developed first some tingling around his mouth and then some tingling in his arms and legs. And when he started to feel that he was getting a little bit of weakness, he decided he needed some medical attention and drove himself to the emergency room. By the time he got to the hospital, however, he was too weak to get out of the car or shout for help. So he was really lucky that somebody noticed him and brought him into the emergency room, because within an hour and a half, he was completely paralyzed and had to be put on a respirator. He did recover fully. So what is the matter with this poor fellow? Yeah, this is paralytic shellfish poisoning. And, you know, just when we were talking about the blue-green algae forming in freshwater, we have formation of other algal blooms in saltwater, and they also create toxins. And those toxins concentrate in shellfish because shellfish are filtering the water to feed. And there's a couple different kinds of shellfish poisoning that you can get this way. The paralytic one is the one that we see most commonly on this coast. We also have had the amnesic one, where people don't recover fully. They lose their ability to retain information. They lose their short-term memory. And in California, what we have been seeing is we've been having these large episodes of sea lion pup, sea mammals washing up on the beach, emaciated, sometimes dead, and with high levels of that toxin in their system. And what research has shown is that even in quantities that are too low to cause illness in an adult, the toxin passes through the placenta and causes brain damage in the developing fetus and seizures. So this was a fairly recent map that I got off of the California Department of Public Health website, showing all of the different beaches that were closed to recreational collection of clams and mussels and scallops and oysters. And you can see so this is for the San Juan Islands, that it's a pretty large area. And if you looked at the Seattle area, you'd see that, and you'd see areas that were closed because of sewage contamination as well. And sometimes they'll be open for collection for everything but the butter clams and the varnish clams, because those particular kinds of clams can hold the toxin for up to a year after the algae bloom. So you don't see anything, everything else is fine, but don't eat them or you can get really sick. The other thing that we're seeing, that type of sickness that you can get from eating shellfish is a Vibrio infection. This is a bacteria that lives in seawater, and when the water is warmer, the bacteria multiply more and the quantity that's in them goes up. Vibrio has been a really big problem for the cultivated shellfish industry, and they have to be shut down when the Vibrio counts get too high. There's two kinds of Vibrio infections. One of them is a really, really bad diarrhea, and it makes you wish you were dead. But the other kind of Vibrio is it goes directly into the bloodstream and spreads throughout your body, and it makes you dead. So these can be very, very serious. And as you can see, since the late 1990s, the rates have increased dramatically. So we've talked a little bit about some of the ways that climate affects food. Let's just talk about a couple others. Crop failure, either due to insufficient rain or too much rain and too much soil moisture, has a big effect on people who are marginal in their ability to provide food for their families. And we've seen price increases of about, just from the last 2 years of drought, of about 13% in the consumer price index for things like meat and dairy products. And if you have people who are just barely making it and you increase the prices 13%, then there's going to be kinds of foods that they're not able to buy for their family. And we know that families who are in that situation, their children have increased health problems. They have a higher rate of hospitalization, and they also have much higher rates of iron deficiency anemia. And that's important because what that means is that they don't have enough red blood. And red blood is what carries oxygen to the brain. So when they are anemic, their brain isn't getting enough oxygen, and they end up with learning problems that unfortunately continue even if we diagnose the anemia and give them iron. We don't know why that is, but that it is. So, and the other thing, even if it's, in addition to the is there going to be enough food and can we afford it, has to do with the safety of the food. And we've talked about the safety of shellfish, but we're also having a problem with something called aflatoxin. And aflatoxin is one of the most powerful natural carcinogens that's known. And it is created by a fungus that affects crops that are stressed. Not all crops, but corn and peanuts especially. And we have been having a big problem in the Midwest and in the Southeast with corn crops that are coming out with levels of aflatoxin which are higher than what's considered safe. Now, in parts of the world where there is frequent drought, like in Africa and in Asia in some places, they have very, very high rates of liver cancer because that's what aflatoxin does. It causes liver cancer. It goes in to the liver and it binds to this gene that suppresses tumor formation and turns it off. So if you have food that has aflatoxin in it, then you have an increased risk of developing liver cancer. But if you have a condition already in your liver where you have some kind of chronic inflammation in your liver because you're an alcoholic, or you have hepatitis C infection, or you are overweight and you have fat collecting in your liver, then the increase is much more. So say it's like 7 times the risk of cancer if you just have the aflatoxin, but it's 60 to 100 times the risk of cancer if you have liver inflammation and the aflatoxin. So we've had, I know that in at least 4 states in the last 2 years, our Food and Drug Administration has said to farmers, we know that your crops are contaminated, but what we're going to do is we're going to sort of look the other way, and we're going to let you blend that aflatoxin contaminated corn with uncontaminated corn to bring the level down below, the legal limit so that you can sell it and you can feed it to your animals. Aflatoxin also comes, if you feed it to cows, it comes out in the milk. And our standard for how much aflatoxin is safe is about 10 times higher than the standards that they have in the European Union. So this is a map just showing the green diamonds are the places where there have been high levels of aflatoxin in corn crops. So you can see it's pretty extensive. And I don't know if, can you read the fine print over there about how high those levels have been? So for human consumption, the limit is 20 parts per billion. And for feeding to cattle, it's 200 to 300 parts per billion, depending on, or for livestock, depending on the situation of what you're going to do with the livestock. So there are some other kinds of toxins that are formed by fungi that we're not going to talk about, but just to, you can see that it's an extensive problem, and that if we continue to have drought, we're going to continue to be exposed to aflatoxin. From a public health point of view, the big concern has to do with the people who have fatty liver, because this is something that goes with obesity and kind of runs in that package of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, obesity, diabetes, and at least 30, possibly more % of the US population, adult population, has fatty liver disease. And we are seeing liver cancers in people who have fatty liver disease. And that is the only cause. And there was a study that was done. In southern Texas, they have unusually high rates of liver cancer. Oh, I have to say a couple other things. Liver cancer is the fastest growing cause of cancer death in the United States. And the rates are higher in Latinos and Native Americans, quite a bit higher than they are in Anglos. And so they were looking at this area around San Antonio where there were a lot of people getting diagnosed with liver cancer, and they went in and they did blood tests just on random people to see if they had aflatoxin in their system, and about 20% of the people that they tested had detectable aflatoxin in their blood. And it was, the levels of aflatoxin were proportional to the amount of corn tortillas that were eaten. So populations that eat more corn are going to have more exposure. We're also seeing an increase in diseases that are spread by insects. And that's because the insects are affected by temperature. Their behavior is affected by temperature. So West Nile virus is a really good example of that. We first had West Nile virus in the United States in 1999, just in New York. And within 4 years, it had spread across the whole country. And climate change is implicated in the speed of that spread. There were some researchers who looked at 13,000 confirmed cases of West Nile virus, and they went back and looked at the weather reports for the times when those infections were contracted, and they found that there was a very clear relationship with temperature and with rainfall. So the rainfall, of course, is, you know, because if there's water that's left in containers and the mosquitoes can breed there. Also, mosquitoes bite more when it's humid, just adding insult to injury, you know. But the other thing is that temperature increases the length of the mosquito breeding season. It speeds up their development and, you know, the amount of time it takes for them to come to maturity and be biting mosquitoes, and it also speeds up the multiplication of virus inside the insects. So this is what happened with West Nile virus, and you can see that it began in a very small area and has spread. And we've had recently some very, very bad summers of West Nile virus. Now, West Nile virus is, for most people, they don't even get any symptoms. About 1 in 5 people get symptoms. But about 1 in 150 people get, other than just having a flu-like illness, they have the virus invades their nervous system and causes lasting neurologic damage. And usually that happens in older people. So we're not all, as you can get the idea as I'm talking about this, that people are not equally vulnerable. There are certain groups in the population who are like the canaries in the coal mine. Essentially, they can't adapt as well. They're more vulnerable, and that's what we're seeing right now, are the increases in the sicknesses and deaths among those groups. Dengue is another good example. This is also transmitted by mosquitoes. We had dengue in the U.S., in the southern states, but it was eradicated during World War II with hefty doses of DDT for mosquito control. But it's back. And we've had 7 outbreaks in Texas, I think 1 in Hawaii, and 3 in southern Florida. And we now have people, it used to be if someone got dengue, it was because they went somewhere else and got bit by the mosquito in some other country that had dengue and then came home and got sick. But now we have cases of people who haven't left the United States who are getting dengue. And there was a big outbreak, the first one was in Key West, Florida. And the health department, after that outbreak, went around. I mean, it wasn't a big outbreak, but still, it was the first dengue that was, you know, that contracted in the United States in many, many years. But they went around and they took blood samples from random households in Key West, and they found that 5% of the people had antibodies to dengue, so had a recent dengue infection. The thing about dengue is that if you get it once, you get a high fever and severe joint pains. They call it breakbone fever is the folk name for dengue fever. But if you get it twice, then your immune system gets involved, and you lose the ability to clot blood, start bleeding, and your blood vessels become leaky, and fluid leaves them and goes into the lungs and into the abdomen. Blood pressure drops, potentially fatal if you don't have excellent supportive medical care. There's no treatment for West Nile virus, dengue. These are all viral infections that all you can do is provide good life support, fluids, oxygen, and hope that the patient can ride it out. So, so those 5% of people who had dengue, even though they didn't get very sick, if they get it again, they could get very, very sick. And this is just showing you the return of dengue from the 60s up until 2005. And you can see it was just kind of centered around the equator where it's the warmest, and then it's gradually spreading to the north and the south as we've had warmer weather in those areas. So that, I think, kind of falls under the category of a safe environment, an environment where you're not being attacked by virus-laden mosquitoes. But there are other environmental hazards that are related to climate change. One of the most important ones is losing your home or having to leave your home. And I learned, I was part of a medical team that went down to help after Hurricane Katrina. And what we learned there was that we were really completely wrong. All the planning and everything had been really wrong. We were thinking that people were going to get sick from, you know, having been in the storm. They would have injuries or they might have infections from the storm water. But what we saw overwhelmingly was people who have chronic diseases who got disconnected from their source of medical care, and they immediately, of course, got worse. I mean, we had diabetics without insulin. We had people who were supposed to be on dialysis, you know, asthmatics with no inhalers, schizophrenics with no psychiatric medication, because we really, you know, it's very common for people to have not only one but multiple chronic illnesses, and when they're suddenly wrenched away from their home and their community, then that decompensates, and that creates a great deal of illness. The other thing, of course, is that these are very emotionally traumatic experiences, and so after major hurricanes and wildfires and things of that nature, up to a third of the residents who had to evacuate developed post-traumatic stress disorder, just like someone who'd been to a war. When we're looking at this from an international point of view, where there's a lot of more people that are going to be displaced, from up to about 200 million people by 2050 is the prediction now. And other parts of the country, especially Asia and the Pacific Islands, are much more vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise than we are, just because of their low-lying and because of the severity of storms that come. And those people also are living, a lot of them, in poverty, and when they can no longer stay in their country, some of them will come to us, and they'll bring their diseases of poverty with them. And diseases of poverty do happen more when you're living in crowded situations, but they are very democratic. And we're talking about tuberculosis, for example. If you're near somebody who has tuberculosis, they cough, you breathe a TB germ, then you have tuberculosis. It doesn't matter if you're poor or not. But the biggest problem from a public health point of view, again, what we're worried about is the kind of tuberculosis that's resistant to medications. Because tuberculosis infections have to be treated for 6 months. And if you miss doses of medication, if that treatment is interrupted, then those bacteria have a chance to become resistant to the medication. In the United States, if you developed active tuberculosis here in Seattle, you would have a nurse come to your house every day to give you and watch you take your medication, because it is so important not to miss any. When we're talking about countries where people are very poor and governments don't have highly functioning, well-endowed health systems, it's very often that treatment is interrupted. And so there's a much higher proportion of people who have multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. Extreme heat, of course, is sort of the obvious thing that people think about when we think about health effects from climate change. And we are having increase in heat waves, and not just in terms of how many or how often, but in terms of how long they last. And these can be extremely lethal, and the longer they last, the more health effect that they have. So a certain temperature on day 1 may cause a certain amount of people to become ill or to get heat stroke, but the same temperature on day 5 could be many, many times more likely to cause more serious problems in more people. So this is from Europe in 2003. 70,000 people died in a heat wave. In 2010 in Russia, 65,000 people died. due to extreme heat. Who's more vulnerable? Elderly people, low-income people, people of color, and people who take certain kinds of medications that make it more difficult to adapt to heat stress, like blood pressure medications, for example. One of the other things, which is something that has just recently come up, is that even if the temperature is not extremely high, if there is a variation in summer temperatures, if the range of high and low is more than usual, then we also see increases in deaths. And there was a study done using what they call mega data, which means that they got Medicare records of people who had been discharged from the hospital for certain chronic conditions, and they followed them to see how many of them died and what was going on with the temperature when they died. And they found that when there was an increase in the variation, that they saw an increase in deaths. Now, from extreme heat in the United States, we usually have maybe 600 people in the whole country who die from extreme heat every year. But that Medicare study came to the conclusion that just because of the increased temperatures, when it's not a heat wave, with that variability, that there's really 10,000 people that die every year from that. So, that's not the end of the bad news. This is sort of mixed bad news and good news here. This is the bittersweet part. If you look at these two graphs, these pie charts, they look kind of the same, don't they? And the one on the left is the sources of greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. And the one on the right is the top 10 causes of death in the United States. And the reason that they look so similar is because if you do this, you get that. We've been spending gradually increasing more and more time in the car, driving more and more distances and doing less walking and cycling. And if you compare the level of physical activity and transportation, physical, moving under your own steam of the United States to other developed countries, we are just pitiful. And it makes us sick. Up to a third of all heart disease, obesity, diabetes, colon cancer, prostate cancer, endometrial cancer, recurrent breast cancer is directly related to physical inactivity. Air pollution also, when we were talking about the particulates and that come from wildfires, and we were talking about ozone. So when we're burning fossil fuel, we're also releasing particulates. And we know that that makes people sick. It causes heart attacks. It causes asthma, as we discussed. And even though we're trying to clean that up by limiting the emissions on motor vehicles, it's harder and harder to do when you have an increasing temperature. Also, another source of our emissions is raising livestock for food. And we eat more meat in the United States than in most other countries. We eat more meat than is recommended to be healthy for us. And the biggest of the meat eaters in our country have higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer as a result. So how does meat cause greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it's because most of the animals that we're eating are ruminants. And so they, they have multiple stomachs, they chew their cud, and they fart. And that releases methane. And methane is 20 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So if you had to sum up everything that I've been saying in one slide, this would be it. We depend on the health of the planet, on having clean air and water, on having safe and sufficient food, and having a safe place to live. And if we are disturbing the balance of nature between us and the climate and the planet, then the planet is sick, then we get sick too. There's really no way around it. Health is not something that's just inside you, that if you exercise and you take vitamins and you eat organic, that you can be healthy. Health is a dance between us and the world that we live in. And if we make that world sick, then we get sick as well. So just a little bit further into the dark side here, and then we're going to turn the corner and talk about solutions. This is something that you can see if you go online, and it is telling us where, if we continue business as usual, what temperatures are we likely to see by the end of the century. And this is one from 2010, and it was in centigrade, so the Fahrenheit degrees are smaller here, and so I made the other one to match, because you can't go back in time and change what I had. But you can see that we haven't made any progress in terms of lowering the effect of our emissions. And not only that, but the blue one here is if every country kept their promises, how much of a difference would it make in that ultimate temperature? And we've lost ground. And one of the reasons that we've lost ground is because the United States has been the international party pooper of global climate work. And because we have not been willing to commit ourselves, other countries who made promises are backing out. So we really are key. What we do, we have a big responsibility, both because of because we're the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, but also because what we do determines what other countries do. And if we are not able to cut our emissions in half here in the US and other developed countries by 2030, global temperature will rise 7 to 12 degrees by the end of the century, and it will stay that way for 1,000 years because it accumulates. It's not like you put some up there and it blows away and then some more comes up. It's all adding up. But we have a prescription. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about denial here. Because even among people who are very concerned about climate, there's a certain kind of denial which still exists a lot. And that is something called tokenism, which is when you do a little gesture about something that doesn't really change doesn't really fix the problem. So, you know, if you hire a black person or a woman in your company and then you pay them less than you pay the white men, that's tokenism. You haven't changed racism, you haven't changed sexism, but you can look at that person and feel pretty good about yourself. And we are doing this a lot because we think that by our individual consumer choices, we're going to be able to slow climate change. And from that thermometer that I showed you, you can see that that's just not true. These are structural problems, and they have to be solved not by individuals making decisions, but by all of us as a country together. So this prescription is not for you. This is a prescription for us. And this is where the solution needs to be done. So that's what this prescription is for. We need to increase active transportation, the percentage of trips that people make that are done by walking and biking. To do that, we have to put the things that people need, shopping, school, work, close enough to where they live that's practical, and we need to have safe places for them to bike and walk. If we did that, this is what we would gain in immediate health benefits. And think of the money that we would save. Surely we would save enough money doing this to pay for some bike lanes and some urban redevelopment. We need to have the maximum energy efficiency that's possible. We know how to do this. This has been demonstrated by other countries in terms of Japan and EU and their fuel economy, and in the U.S. in different cities like Chicago and Oakland with housing retrofits. We know that we can decrease our energy use in buildings enough to decrease emissions 25%, but we haven't done it on a broad basis. We need to take those successful programs and scale them up to nationwide. And we need to put an end to the use of fossil fuel, and we really have to turn the corner now. There is no reason that we should be constructing new coal-burning power plants, and all the ones we have should be closed by 2030. And we should put the cost of dirty energy up front so that when people are making decisions, they're seeing the whole price. We're paying for it now. I mean, the cost of a gallon of gas is really about $15 a gallon, but you pay some of it at the pump, and you pay the rest of it with your health insurance premium, with your taxes, with your life. And so we need to put all of that up front. And if we did that, we would have a major improvement in air quality, the thing that we've been struggling with for years and years and haven't really been able to get there. If we stop burning fossil fuel, we'll get there. And we'll have 20,000 less heart attacks, 23,000 deaths every year as a result. And we need to change the way that we support agriculture. Our tax dollars should be supporting farmers to grow the food that we should be eating, and not food that's for feeding cattle or for burning up to in gasoline. And if we did that, look at all of the lives we would save and all the illnesses that we would prevent. So it's really a win-win situation. This is not. It's not like something would be taken away from us if we address climate change by making these changes. There's a great cartoon that I don't have up here. I wish I had to show you, but it's up on our website, and it's a bunch of people in a meeting, and one of them says, "What if this climate change turns out to be nothing, and we made a better world just for nothing?" Michael Goldsmith Gutierrez was born and raised in Seattle. Even though his grandparents have diabetes and heart disease, and his mom had asthma as a baby, he and his sister are healthy, and his parents are healthy as well. They live in a house which is warm in winter, cool in summer, and powered by the sun and the wind. They ride their bicycles on paths that connect their home to school, work, and the market, where they buy fresh vegetables produced by neighbors. There are still heavy storms, forest fires, and floods. Water is rationed, and there are times Michael isn't allowed outdoors because of extreme heat or mosquitoes. But before he was born, his community decided to move to higher ground, generate their own energy with solar panels and wind farms, and make sure all their public works could withstand heavy weather. Sometimes when they sit around together in the evenings, Michael likes to hear his grandmother tell about the olden days. He likes to imagine living in a great big house, driving a fast gasoline car, having bubble baths, and eating food from around the world. But his favorite part of the story is when people got together all over the earth and made their governments sign and abide by the great global treaty, and then how everyone worked together to build communities where people live well without warming the world.